Okay, this is Lauren's first plane ride right here. We was raised in a very rural area of North Carolina where there was hardly jobs or any work, and the only form of work that was there was farming. We used to go and pick cotton or potatoes or beans or something like that. Instead of us being in school, sometimes we had to be in the field. I remember, my hair was unkempt. I used to wear the same thing over and over and over to school at least 3 times a week. I was really an unkempt little girl.
Like many people growing up in North Carolina in the 50s and 60s, Elaine Riddick Jesse never had the real opportunity she'd been guaranteed as an American citizen. Her fate was bound up with a state built on a system of segregation and Jim Crow laws. The Windfall community suffered in extreme poverty. Elaine watched her parents' marriage fall apart, eventually leading social workers to send her to live with her grandmother. Then, Elaine's life took another tragic turn.
I was a victim of rape. I was molested when I was 13 years old. And the guy that raped me told me if I told anybody that he was going to kill me. So I had to keep it to myself.
Eventually, the social worker noticed that Elaine was pregnant, assumed that she was promiscuous, and recommended that Elaine be examined by the state Eugenics Board.
The Eugenics Board was a board of 5 men that sat around a table, and of course they were white men too. They sat around a table and they just marked the paper. Anybody that the social worker would deem feeble-minded or slow or having a problem, the social worker would come in and say, I want this person sterilized. And boom, they stamped it and that was that.
The board was presented with an evaluation from the social worker, who insisted that there was no hope for Elaine, that she got along poorly with other children, and that an IQ test showed that she was feeble-minded.
No one asked me, what's wrong? Can I help you? Are you hungry? Are you cold? Maybe I'm sick. No one took the time to find out what was the problem.
Elaine discovered the board had completely ignored another evaluation they received by a psychologist who said her chief problem was her environment. She was doing above-average work in school, and any difficulties she had getting along with others was likely due to the fact that she was always being bullied by other students and was generally hungry. The board favored the social worker's recommendation.
I had my son and I woke up in bandages, not knowing what it was for. They went inside of me and sterilized me without my knowledge because I was Black, poor, and my mother was in a prison. My dad was running around. He was an alcoholic. My mother was an alcoholic. So they automatically assumed that I was going to become an alcoholic. And then, without even my son as a baby, automatically assuming that he was the 3rd generation and that he was going to be an alcoholic also. What they wanted to do was nip it in the bud right then. Stop this family tree. They want to cut the tree down. And I want to know who in the world give these people the right to go and do these sort of things to another human being. Even in Germany, Hitler didn't have the right to do this. We're the ones that educated Hitler on this stuff here, sterilization.
My interest in eugenics certainly comes in part from the experience of myself being a refugee from Hitler and being keenly aware of what was done in the name of science, and specifically in the name of genetics. But that happened in this country as well, of course, in a certain sense. The Nazis imported it from the United States, which had a flourishing eugenics movement.
At the turn of the 20th century, eugenics was widely accepted in the United States as solid science among the country's top psychologists, scientists, politicians, and social thinkers. During this first Gilded Age, it was the creation of the gene concept itself that ignited what became a powerful eugenics movement.
So one reason that the eugenics movement was so influential at the time was because it provided a scientific solution, or a supposedly scientific solution, to a political problem.
The Gilded Age was the first time in American history in which you had people sitting on top of the entire economy, vast fortunes made on the backs of average people. At the same time, a new wave of immigrants coming into this country with nothing. And our cities became fetid slums in contrast to the extraordinary wealth that the robber barons, as we called them, were enjoying. We were in danger of losing our economy and our democracy.
People forget, in 1900, there was no middle class in America. In 1900, there was no weekend in America. There's not one single paid holiday. We had this extreme laissez-faire, social Darwinist reality, and the vast majority of Americans were fighting to change it.
People took to the streets, held massive general strikes, demanded better living and working conditions, and an end to laissez-faire, unregulated capitalism.
If that's the explanation, then the true way to fix that is to pay higher wages and to give people a better environment in which to live. And it was clear which explanation would be preferable to the captains of capitalist industry in the early 20th century, and that is the biological explanation.
The wealthiest families in the country provided millions in research funding to scientists in an attempt to prove that social problems were primarily a result of defective genetics. At the prestigious Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York, Harry Laughlin, an animal breeder, directed the eugenics record office. He claimed they could predict who would inherit good or bad traits by using a mathematical formula from Mendel. They were also firm believers in Charles Darwin, who clearly applied his theory of natural selection to human society. Eugenicists saw themselves as agents of evolution, doing their duty to ensure that the fittest Americans survived.
They said, we have to find a way to have people who are more evolved make more babies. We have to find a way to have people who are poor and who have all these diseases and all this bad genetic structure produce less.
Laughlin organized exhibits in communities across the country to educate the public about eugenics. Families underwent detailed physical and mental examinations as they competed to win the prize for the best heredity. But eugenicists disagreed on what should be done with people they considered unfit. Some argued that laissez-faire economic policies might be severe enough to eliminate so-called defectives from the gene pool.
Society should not coddle in any way the poor. Don't help them. Don't help them through charity. Don't help them through legislation. You see, if you help them, according to the social Darwinists, you would only enable them to reproduce more of them. Society would be better off if we instituted survival of the fittest. We would get stronger, just as species become stronger when their weakest members die off and their strongest members live on to reproduce.
But it would take decades before this social Darwinian approach would be effective. So many eugenicists considered a quicker solution, one that would eventually be used by the Nazis: euthanasia. Some called for outright execution of the unfit, as well as lethal neglect of newborns they considered defective. But in the end, they agreed that euthanasia would be used at too dear a moral price. Sterilization was the favored alternative. Biologist Harry Laughlin wrote the model law that North Carolina eventually used to sterilize Elaine Riddick. He called for millions of people he considered defective to be forcibly sterilized, as well as relatives who might be carrying supposed recessive genes for inferior traits. In 1927, the Supreme Court upheld Harry Laughlin's model law and ruled 8-1 that the Constitution permitted U.S. citizens to be forcibly sterilized. Congress never passed a federal sterilization law, but it's estimated that by the end of World War II, under state laws, at least 80,000 Americans had been forced to undergo hysterectomies, tubal ligation, vasectomies, and castration.
It was only in 1933, after the Nazis took over, that Germany had any eugenic laws at all. The first law they passed was for the heredity of future generations, and that was their sterilization law. And they modeled it on Laughlin's model law. In fact, they were so grateful to Laughlin for his leadership in this area that they gave him an honorary medical degree from Heidelberg in 1936 for research on purifying the germplasm of the human population.
Laughlin was an enthusiastic supporter of the Third Reich. The Eugenical News, which Laughlin edited, just fawned over Germany and its progressive policies. And in fact, there was a certain envy. Germany is getting too far ahead of us in applying the conclusions of science to the structure of society. The most significant similarity was the emphasis on racial purity.
Strict control of immigration was crucial to eugenic goals. In the 1920s, Congress debated whether to impose racial quotas and hired Harry Laughlin as a special agent to investigate the subject and offer his recommendations. Laughlin particularly wanted to shut out Eastern and Southern Europeans.
Immigrants were being castigated as low-level people, as the dregs of humanity. Words like this were used in publications as prestigious as the Saturday Evening Post, and the call was very strong politically and economically to restrict immigration. What Harry Laughlin provided was charts of data that he took to the Congressional Committee, purporting to show that people from Italy, from Poland, from the Slavic countries were genetically inferior to the Northern European, to the Nordic, the Aryan, the Anglo-Saxon, and that this genetic inferiority was going to have a major impact on future generations in the United States.
Laughlin presented data from supposedly objective IQ tests that immigrants were forced to take at Ellis Island upon their arrival. Laughlin neglected to mention that many of them were reeling from the crowded 2-week journey they just made across the Atlantic. Trips that were often marked by sickness, sleeplessness, and hunger. If they didn't do well on math problems or abstract image or writing tests, immigrants were marked with an X, declared feeble-minded, and deported.
And they used eugenics arguments that people who were coming in had these bad genes. The Congress passed overwhelming legislation to limit the capacity of these groups to come in.
Even when it was clear that Jewish people were being persecuted by the Nazis, they were a central target of the racial quotas and were denied entry into the United States. In some estimates, up to 2 million Jewish immigrants who died in the Holocaust might have escaped their fate if Congress hadn't passed the racist law. In 1939, nearly 1,000 refugees escaped, and sailed all the way to Cuba, hoping to eventually enter the United States. They were stranded in the waters off Havana as they awaited news of their fate. Families rowed out to the ship, hoping to get a glimpse of their loved ones. But the Cuban government turned them away, and the White House was silent. The refugees were forced to return to Europe as the Nazis expanded their occupation. The same year, a bill was introduced that would have allowed 20,000 children, most of them Jewish, to come to the United States. Foster families were ready to take them in. But Laughlin and other members of an anti-Semitic coalition lobbied against relaxing the racial quotas for any reason. The bill was defeated, leaving the children no escape from the hands of the Nazis. The widespread rejection of Jewish refugees convinced the Nazis that other nations shared their views of Jewish racial inferiority.
Since being Jewish was considered to be an inherited thing, you couldn't convert away from it. The only thing to do to rid the body politic of that burden was kill people. And that makes that worst crime of history a piece of bad science, among other things. When Hitler was elected in 1933 in a free election, one of his slogans was, "All politics is applied biology." Okay? And that's the red light that one has to see on the road and not go down that road, ever.
I have no intention of sitting idly by and watching my husband's dream turn into a nightmare.
And so the forces appear to be joined, the poor people declaring that they have declared war on the administration's efforts to cut off the war on poverty.
Despite the controversy, the administration was able to move many war on poverty programs out of the Office of Economic Opportunity to other agencies and cut funding by more than 50%. However, Nixon did expand federal support for a war on poverty program he felt very strongly about: birth control for the poor.
The people in what we call our class control their populations. The people who don't control their families are the people that shouldn't have kids.
As part of its birth control effort, the administration quietly distributed a memo to federal clinics across the country, informing them that for the first time, war on poverty funds could be used to cover the costs of sterilizations.
It was a program that became abused because the people at the top who were distributing the money never bothered to issue the rules and regulations that would have made sure that adult women and men who were interested in family planning and interested in contraception could get what they wanted. And instead, it became a program that for many people resulted in forced sterilizations.
Joseph Levin filed a lawsuit against the Nixon administration after he discovered that two young girls, Minnie Ralph, age 14, and Mary Alice Ralph, age 12, were sterilized at a clinic in Montgomery, Alabama.
At no time prior to the surgery did any physician discuss with the girls or their parents the nature or consequences of the surgery to which Minnie and Mary Alice were about to be subjected. The girl's
mother was given a consent form by the doctor. He knew she couldn't read, and clinic workers pressured Minnie to sign a consent form, falsely stating she was 21.
Dr. Warren Hearn, working at the War on Poverty, develops these guidelines. And these guidelines say that no one can be sterilized without informed consent and there can be no coercion. So these guidelines actually would have prevented the sterilization of the Ralph sisters.
But his guidelines were never delivered to the clinics. They were being held up at the White House.
I got a call from Dr. Cooper telling me that I must refrain from any contact with the White House or OMB. And I said I was just trying to do my job and find out where the guidelines were. My attempts to find out about them were met with hostility, harassment, attempts at intimidation, and pointed invitations to resign.
Finally, he realized they weren't going to distribute them, and so he quit.
So these guidelines were never distributed to clinics. Even the 200 copies that Dr. Hearn had himself were taken out of his office and put in a safe place. And in the following investigation about what happened to these guidelines, the White House responds to the questions by saying, it suited our purposes. It suited our purposes to suppress these guidelines.
We came to learn that maybe there were as many as 500 of these clinics functioning throughout the United States. And it was sort of up to the nurses and the doctors as to who got what. And they made their judgment about who was worthy and who wasn't.
We are suing HEW for non-enforcement, non-monitoring of the sterilization regulations. We are also seeking consent forms in Spanish and
I'm talking about the deprivation and the genocide of American Indian people. I'm talking about our women. 42% who were sterilized from 1971 to 1975, and not a whimper from this, of indignation from this country.
The U.S. District Court judge who resided over the Ralph case found that during the Nixon administration, nearly 400,000 poor people were sterilized without being fully informed. There was evidence, the judge said, that an indefinite number had been coerced into operations under the threat of losing federal assistance. Many others were sterilized without their knowledge.
It almost sounded as if we were talking about some Nazi-era plan. It really was a practice of eugenics because these clinics didn't see anything wrong with controlling the birth rate of people who they viewed as a burden on society. That simple.
The hospital after 3 days.
The Ralph lawsuit resulted in Judge Gerhard Gesell requiring the federal government to issue stringent guidelines on sterilization, and that included a ban on the sterilization of any minor, anyone under 18. So what we have here is a real triumph for the Ralph family. They take this case all the way to federal court in Washington, D.C., and they say, you know what? This happened to our daughters, but we're not going to let it happen to anybody else's daughter ever again. And after this litigation, they win. And this stops the entire second wave of sterilizations in the United States.